that missionaries will never show you the verses that show how echad is used about one without another. They'll never show you the counter verses, like Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verse 8, where it says, and there was one and not another. Or in Isaiah 51, verse 2, where it says, Abraham was but one. It means only one Abraham, not 2 or 3 or 5. But this is making things very confusing. So now you're telling me the number one in English and echad in Hebrew can mean a compound unity, or it can mean one alone and not another. Well, that raises a problem for me. How do I know? How can I tell then, when I'm examining a verse, is there a technique that I can know which echad does it mean? Could anyone tell me the answer of how we can tell whether the number one in the English language in a sentence means a compound unity or just one alone? What would I do? I would look at the context. The simple thing to do is if I have collective nouns, then I know it means a compound unity. If I say the chair and the table is one set, so we know that number one means a compound unity. If I say there is one alone, or there is only one chair, then I know it doesn't mean a compound unity, but it means one alone. And all we have to do is look at the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. It's talking about one God. Not many gods that become one. Even though Judaism doesn't really have a catechism, we don't have much dogma. But there was a great sage who lived during the Middle Ages. His name was Moses Maimonides. He was the first person to really articulate a series of ideas that the Jewish people believe. That if you reject these notions, then essentially you have in some way painted yourself outside of the pale of what is considered Judaism. The second of Maimonides' 13 principles of faith, I believe with perfect faith that the Creator, blessed be His name, is unique. And the word there is yachid, which means alone. And that there is no uniqueness which even remotely resembles His. And that He alone was, is, and ever will be our God. This is considered one of the fundamental principles of the Jewish faith. And indeed, you know, in synagogue at the end of the services, you sing on the Sabbath, you sing the Yigdal. That's also not a signal to follow Talis. The Yigdal, of course, is a poem that was written that takes each of the 13 principles of Maimonides, and we sing it. It's a way to remember it well. Now, what Christians have said, and I've heard this many times, and that is that, you see, Maimonides changed the word of the Shema. He changed the word of the Shema from echad to yachid. And although I agree that the word yachid means alone, and there is no other, but echad doesn't mean that. Echad means the compound unity. Of course, what's very silly is anyone who has even a perfunctory knowledge of the Hebrew language, you'll see that there's no relationship between that and the words that we find in the Shema. Maimonides is not quoting from the Jewish scriptures. What he's doing is he's condensing many verses that are found throughout Tanakh, throughout the Jewish scriptures, into basic tenets of Judaism. We understand why Christians who believe in the Trinity find the idea that God is alone, that God is unique. That's a deeply offensive statement. There's good reason why the Messianic movement is deeply offended by Maimonides' second statement of faith. Because they cannot deal with the idea, they reject the notion that God is alone, that there is no other one, because they believe in three persons that make up the Godhead. But was Maimonides in any way causing distress? Was Maimonides in any way altering the message of the Jewish scriptures? Or is this the composite of exactly what we find throughout the Jewish scriptures? And indeed, what we find over and over again is that very concept, I am alone, there is no one with me. What Maimonides was saying was in perfect harmony to what we find throughout the Jewish scriptures. As a matter of fact, the element that always underscores God's oneness is that God's alone. And you will find, by the way, when examining statements in the Jewish scriptures that point to the central monotheistic theme of it, you will find that the Jewish scriptures far more talks about God being alone and no other than actually attaching the number one to God. Right in the beginning of the Ten Commandments, I am the Lord your God. There is no other God besides me. Very clear. We don't even have the number one in the Ten Commandments. What we do have is There's me alone and there's no one else. The idea that don't make a mistake of some sort of partnership in the Godhead is far more important to the Jewish scriptures than getting caught up with the number one, echad. When you study the history of the pagan faiths as they interacted with the Jewish people, what you will find very fascinating that many of the arguments that the church used today was used by pagan faiths who were indeed openly polytheistic. And what we find is there's one verse that's used often by evangelical missionaries to prove again that there's a plurality within God. Genesis 1:26, and God said, "Let us make man in our image after our likeness." This is a well-known verse, and Christians will say, aha, here you have an open proof, a clear example where there's a plurality within the Godhead. There is not one God alone, just God the Father who you Jews pray to, but there's many. There's more than one. That's why it says, Na'aseh Adam, let us make man in our image. Now, one of the reasons why I usually don't cover this is because this argument is so erroneous. It lacks so much foundation. It says so much about the person who is bringing it up that even the vast majority of Christian scholars who are Trinitarians will tell you that this in no way points to the Trinity. And that's something that's important to understand. You know, sometimes when you want to prove something, sometimes it's better to prove it from your opponent's side. Actually show them from a Christian source rather than even trying to prove it from a Jewish source. Sometimes it's more effective. So what I did is I took some very well-known Christian scholars. None of these men would be considered a foe of the Trinity. G.J. Wenham. Christians have traditionally seen Genesis 1:26 as enumerating. By the way, I always feel that anyone who uses such a fancy word like that has to be right, which means foreshadowing the Trinity. It is now universally admitted that this was not what the plural meant to the original author. If you take out an NIV study Bible, these are not Unitarians here. If you look under the commentary of Genesis 1:26, which says us, our, God speaks as the Creator King, announcing His crowning work to the members of His heavenly court. The Ryrie Study Bible, oh boy, the person who put that together comes from Dallas Theological Seminary. We're dealing with a very conservative Christian here. We're not dealing with liberals here. The plurals of majesty. The Liberty Annotated Study Bible. Did you ever hear of Jerry Falwell? Oh boy, right? He's certainly no foe of the Trinity. It explains that this is certainly most likely speaking of a majestic plurality. What do these men mean? Why are they saying this? I mean, they're all people that would have loved to use Genesis 1:26 as a proof of the Trinity. There would be no question that if they saw there was any way to use it, they would love to put their hands on it. Even they understand that they're going to have to forego Genesis 1:26. And by the way, these are all people that believe Isaiah 53 is speaking about Jesus. I mean, these are not, these are the most right-wing elements of the Christian camp. Why are they so convinced that, listen, you missionaries, don't use Genesis 1:26. Jews have it right on that. What convinces them? What's so compelling to these men? When you're dealing with hermeneutics, whenever you're dealing with understanding Scripture and interpreting Scripture, there are two rules that one never forgets. Rule number one is, Scripture interprets Scripture. Text interprets text. It's a fundamental principle whenever you're trying to gain understanding from Scripture. Rule number two, a Scripture in the dark can never interpret a Scripture in the light. Only a Scripture that's in the light can interpret a Scripture that's in the dark. That tells us more about principle number one. What does that all mean? Very often the Jewish Scriptures will make a statement and it will be vague. For instance, in Genesis 15 as an example, it says there that Abraham had faith in God and God accounted that as righteous. So Christians say, aha, all you need is faith. There it is, grace right there. But, of course, once you look in Genesis 26 verse 5, it helps us understand what does that mean that Abraham had faith and accounted it for righteousness. Does that mean that, like us, that we're supposed to have faith in God? That God exists? That's impossible. Not only did Abraham speak to God, but God spoke back to him. Not only inside him, he spoke to him. Like Dr. Shapiro, line 3. I mean, he spoke to him.